Hey everyone, I'm Jennifer Chu, the Center for Asian American Media's Membership and Donor Relations Manager. I'm joining you from the East Bay area on the unceded territories of the Ohlone, Muwekma, and Chochenyo peoples, who, along with hundreds of other Native tribes, have resided in California for thousands of years. Thank you for joining us at Storytellers Session, Karthick Ramakrishnan. We are honored to present this conversation between political scientist and author Karthick Ramakrishnan and CAAM's Executive Director, Stephen Gong. Following their conversation, you'll have the opportunity to ask Karthick your questions during the Q&A. Share your questions in the chat box and add Q at the beginning to help us identify them. We'll also share a few of the questions submitted in advance using the registration form. If you need any technical support, please send an email to events@caamedia.org. We would like to thank the wonderful organizations that helped us promote today's program. They are AAPI's for Civic Empowerment Education Fund, API Council, and API Vote. I encourage you to check out these wonderful organizations and support their important work. For 41 years, the Center for Asian American Media has brought Asian American stories to light by supporting the careers of and projects made by storytellers, presenting their work through our annual festival, CAAMFest, and distributing films to educational institutions throughout the United States. If you aren't familiar with CAAM and our work, I encourage you to check our website, caamedia.org, and social media for more information on our year-round programs, events, and initiatives. Programs like this and CAAM's support of storytellers and cultural leaders like Karthick is made possible thanks to people like you and our wonderful community of members and supporters. If you aren't yet a member or supporter, I hope you'll consider joining at caamedia.org/membership or making a tax-deductible donation of any amount at caamedia.org/donate. Join today and you'll receive free admission to programs like this, along with special access to our 40th anniversary CAAMFest in 2022. Feel free to contact me if you have any questions. I hope you'll join us at some of our other upcoming and current programs and events. So you can watch the online premiere of the 6 short films created by the BIPOC filmmakers of our Hindsight Project, starting on July 29th on World Channel's YouTube channel, at pbs.org, PBS video app, and Real South's website. They'll also be broadcast on PBS this November. CAAM has 2 films in PBS's Short Film Festival 2021, Atomic Cafe and Phony. I encourage you to watch and share these films by July 23rd, last day of the festival, at pbs.org/film festival. Again, for more information on all of these programs and events, check our website and social media. Now with that, please welcome CAAM's Executive Director, Stephen Gong.
Thank you, Jen. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. This is very exciting, and I've been looking forward to this conversation for several months. I know that many of you watching are familiar with Karthick in one or more of his roles as a noted educator, author, and thinker, and we recently featured a profile of Karthick on our blog. But I'd like to highlight just a few of his accomplishments for those of you who are not familiar with him. He's a professor of public policy and political science at the University of California, Riverside, and founding director of its Center for Social Innovation. As was noted in the slides, he's published many articles and written 7 books, including most recently, Citizenship Reimagined. Karthick serves on the board of the California Endowment. He chairs the California Commission on APIA Affairs and serves on the U.S. Census Bureau's National Advisory Committee. He's the founding director of AAPIData.com, which publishes demographic data and policy research on Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. He has a BA in International Relations from Brown University and a PhD in politics from Princeton. More about that. So good evening, Karthick.
Thanks, Stephen. Thanks for having me here.
We are thrilled. It's great to see you. You look great. Karthick, you know, I have personally enjoyed seeing several of your incredible in-depth PowerPoint presentations where you share data, and you're often sharing sort of the latest data and giving us some incredible insights, into especially the depth that you can gain through disaggregated data that dispels many of the myths about our community. And of course, it goes without saying, this is an incredibly troubled time in which the attacks on Asian Americans across the nation really cry out for deeper understanding. So there's some vital issues here at play. And so we're going to get at a bit of those, but we're not going to be able to do a full-blown presentation. And at any point, if you want to point us toward our viewers towards how they can sort of stay in touch with the AAPIA data information, we'd love for you to do that. But I actually wanted to say that one of the real aims we have tonight, because this is a space where we often converse with storytellers, I wanted to dig more deeply into that notion of storytelling with you. And I thought we'd start by delving a little bit more into your personal history. So we've asked you to provide some photos, and if you wouldn't mind right off leading us through some images that you've picked that tell us all a little bit more about you and your personal journey.
Thank you, Stephen. And yes, so if you can put up those slides, I think one of the things I think there are probably a lot of things that people don't know about me that are important to who I am today, not only in terms of who I am as a person, but also the work that I do. So if we could bring up the slides. So first, important part to know about me is that I'm an immigrant. And I was born in India, and I moved to Canada when I was 10. And I think like a lot of other Indian immigrants who were born in the mid-70s like me, like all the photos I know from my childhood are all black and white. There are no color photos, right? And in fact, I remember the television that we first had in our household was a black and white TV. It was a novelty to see color televisions in the early 1980s in India. So that's me. You might actually not quite know who I am among the three children there. Sometimes with kids you can spot right away, but I'm the person on the bottom left. So I'm the middle child. So that's also another important fact about me. As a middle child, I think I had a keen sense of the fairness and unfairness of life from the beginning, and really, watching out for the underdog. Part of that, I think it's really powerful. We don't give birth order enough credit in terms of how people are made, but also being an immigrant. So I moved to Canada. People think of Canada as this multicultural heaven, and certainly there's a lot to be said for Canada. We moved to a blue-collar neighborhood where I got beat up, called names. People talk about assimilation as if it's just a natural and neutral process. It's actually a pretty painful process involving ridicule at the very least, but sometimes beyond that. So what you see in the middle panel is our family on the way from India to Canada. We stopped in Amsterdam along the way. We flew business class. It was my second flight anywhere. And we were like on business class and like totally not dressed appropriately, I would say. That's us in our safari suits, if you will. It's a kind of respectability that, and I remember that with my dad, that when we were traveling, that trip, and even for the first year in Canada, that we always watched what we said and did, because we were somehow ambassadors and representatives of our entire country. So that's what I have in the middle there. And then what you see on the right is me in high school. So not many, I had more hair back then. Word of advice to young people: when you have hair, just flaunt it. You never know when you're going to get it back quite in the same way. And that was in my phase as junior, heading into senior year in high school. I went through my Henry David Thoreau phase of just being the rebel, and just celebrating my difference, going from someone who's trying to assimilate for someone who didn't mind standing out and really reveled in it. So that was me through high school. So I don't know. Okay, so the next slide, I guess. Yeah, so I'll just go through all of them. I don't know, Stephen, if you wanted to like say, interject anything there.
No, I'll come back to you at the end.
Okay. And so next is grad school. So, grad school was very atypical for me. So first of all, I went to Brown for undergrad. That's like the hotbed of liberalism. I actually kind of mellowed out. I was very liberal when I was, I grew up in central Massachusetts, pretty conservative. So I was pretty outspoken in high school. At Brown, I think there are so many more people that are more radical than me that I think it had a bit of a moderating effect. Then I went to Princeton and some of that activism came back, but I just got very heavily involved in extracurricular activities, more so than I did when I was at Brown. So I was one of the co-founders of the first South Asian student theater group in the country. It still exists. It's called Princeton South Asian Theatrics, or PSAT for short. And it's a play on words. It's the way that a lot of Indian parents, they don't say the PSAT, they call it the SAT and the PSAT. So it was great. We wrote our own original skits, and actually skits that were like full-length plays. It started off as a skit for a cultural show, and it was just, it ended up being my kind of adopted family, if you will, when I was in grad school. In grad school, I also took classes in film and video production. My political science professor is like, what is this guy doing? Like, he's in theater groups. He's like taking film and video production. I did fine in my other classes. I still took classes in demography and statistics. But for me, this was important. I was also a columnist for the newspaper the way I was in high school. And I think that really helps kind of shape who I am today. I mean, I've been always wanting to try to influence public perception, right? And change public opinion. What you see on the right is my family today, or at least a couple of years ago when we were traveling, and that's a photo in Iceland. We love to travel. Our kids are resilient, I think, precisely because we travel every year somewhere. Not always pleasant. I remember Millen, our younger one, when he was just an aggressive crawler and about learning to walk. We took a 30-hour flight from LA to Nepal for a program that Brinda was doing there. So it's not always a smooth ride, but I truly believe that our kids are much more resilient, including during the pandemic, because of our international exposure. And then when we go to the final slide, that's closer to today, and this includes my family at API Data. So one more slide. Yeah. So. We have a couple more members. In fact, we just welcomed a new member to API Data today, Nines Ponce, who is an incredible health researcher at UCLA. But this is Jennifer Lee and Janelle Wong, and we're just very close. We did the National Asian American Survey together, and we tag team, right? So I'm in California for the most part. Janelle's at the University of Maryland, but that's virtually DC. So to the extent that we need to have a DC presence, Janelle is able to cover API Data there. And then Jennifer is in New York. She doesn't do as much media in terms of television, say, but she's just incredible on social media in terms of being able to craft messages that go viral, and it's such an incredible asset. These are all wonderful scholars too. I mean, I'm not talking at all about the kind of scholarship we do. It's just I just feel blessed to have colleagues like Jennifer and Janelle, and then Sarah Sadhwani and Nines Ponce as well. So I think I'm done with my background in storytelling there, Stephen.
Okay. Oh, I'm sorry. I thought there was one more.
Oh, is there? Oh, there might be. Okay, let's go one more slide. Yeah, oh, yes. No, thanks for reminding me. I think I saw a version that it was a composite. I also chair the California Commission on APIA Affairs. And you'll see us here with Rob Bonta when he chaired the API Legislative Caucus. Just most recently, it's been a trying year and a half for our communities, but it's also been inspiring. So I don't know if people saw the news. Our commission, working with the API Legislative Caucus in California and a coalition of 150 community organizations led by the Stop API Hate Coalition, we just helped pass a $157 million package. And it's incredible, right? And most of it goes to help communities that have been adversely affected by the pandemic and the rise in hate incidents. But we also have investments in data equity, including in API data. One of the things you'll see moving forward is investments in accurate data collection so that the state can better understand the needs of our community when it comes to language barriers, other barriers to care, and the kinds of investments they need to make to better serve our communities. But again, none of this is an individual effort. I mean, these are all team efforts here.
Well, that's wonderful, Karthick. Thank you so much. Before we leave that sense of your history, you told me in an earlier call a kind of a funny, but I think telling story about you personally, that you were first admitted to Harvard University, in a sense, right? The ultimate goal of an Asian American family, and yet you turned it down. Is this correct?
It is correct. And first, I'll just credit my parents to be very understanding parents, right? So I got into Harvard. I actually got into Harvard twice, both for undergrad and grad, and turned it down both times. So I hope this does not mean that, you know, in the future, if I want to get a job there, they'll return the favor to me. But it turned a lot of heads. I actually remember an aunt telling me later that she could never forgive me for turning down Harvard, you know, as if it's like, I think they question my judgment and my sanity. But, you know, it's what's a good fit. And I just concluded that Brown was a better fit. I mean, I'd been so ambitious and go in high school that at Brown, I just kind of wanted to chill out. And Brown is a place where you could chill out, especially if you're not in like engineering or pre-medicine. You could actually just, take classes for the love of learning. You didn't have to take classes for grades. I mean, although I did for almost all of them, but it just encouraged you to experiment and explore. And I really, I valued that. Another thing I'll say about my parents, unlike a lot of other South Asian parents I knew at the time, they were very flexible and understanding. So we had a very kind of open, communicative relationship, and no secrets among us. And, I started off my college studies as a religious studies major. And I remember another, uncle, as it were, a doctor in the community. I remember him saying, and I'm not going to do the accent here, but essentially, religion, I mean, that's a good hobby, but, come on, you got to get serious here. It's the rest of your life you're talking about. And, that line left such an impression on me. It made it into our first full-length play called Daisies of Our Lives, in which there's a character who wants to go to Princeton and study theater, and the parents like, hobbies, like, no, you can't be serious. No, that's not something you study.
Well, I'm truly taken with your background, Karthick. And when I started to hear more about it, to me, it informed all of the other work you're doing and where we're going to go with this conversation, right? Talking about storytelling, because I think in some ways you've broken a mold, you've broken through in a sense on your data-driven work. But actually, one more question before I get there, while we're still in this space. Do you have a mentor or a cultural moment that really stands out for you that also kind of made you turn toward this direction that we now see in all of your work?
I'll give you two, but I'll cheat here a little bit. The first one you can actually read on CNN.com, which was when I was in high school and, faced fair amount of kind of xenophobic kind of fury directed at me after I'd written a pretty critical editorial piece. And I wrote it around the time that President Trump was saying to the squad that if they complain about so many things in this country, they should just go back to where they came from, right? And so that was an important moment for me to have the courage to just stand up and not be intimidated by that. Of course, I recognize my gender privilege in this. I know colleagues of mine who, when they write pieces, the kind of vitriol that is directed towards API women when they speak up on social media is just far, far more severe than anything I experienced. But that was a kind of formative moment. Another formative moment was when I was in grad school. I got my paper accepted to the American Political Science Association. Now, this is the national Political Science Association's very competitive, hard to get your papers in there. I got it in there, and I was so excited. I saw that my panel had people whose work I had cited. So I thought this is going to be incredible. It was a paper on immigrant voting across racial groups and across immigrant generations. It hadn't been done in quite the same way. So I get there Thursday, 8 a.m. I didn't realize that's not necessarily a good time period for these conferences in terms of attendance. So I get there, and there were 4 people in the audience. And I looked at the rest of the panelists, and they seemed like this was just normal to them. Like they weren't batting an eye. I was like, this is not the impact I want to have in the world. I don't want to just be speaking to an audience of 4 or even 40. The work, especially on immigrant civic engagement, was too important, and it remains so important. And that really, I mean, I think in some ways I was already there because I was a newspaper columnist in grad school. I was a newspaper editor in high school. But really, I decided then and there to try a job at a think tank. So I worked at the Public Policy Institute of California in San Francisco. And it was incredible, right? When I came from my job visit, it was right next to Chinatown. And I remember staying, I forget the hotel, and I got in late at night and I just saw this flashing light. And I was like, I don't know what that is. Wake up the next day, right? And it's, I forget, it was Alcatraz, right? Across the bay. It was just incredible. And I was like, I love this city. I'm going to love this job. And it was great for 3 years. I mean, even though I had the motivation and experience, I really honed my craft in terms of being able to translate academic work to policy audiences and more general audiences.
You know, I have to credit you, Karthik. I think, gosh, I think I've seen, it's been at least 10 years since I was introduced to your work. And, you know, as each election cycle rolled through and each midterm, and I remember at the beginning of that kind of period, I have a good friend who's really into politics in a big way. And I would always be asking him, you know, around the year 2000, like, you know, Asian Americans are never mentioned. And he said, well, you know, yeah, you don't vote. Your people don't vote. And he's a sympathetic guy, but it was kind of like, when will we see this change? And I think not only have you charted the growth and development of Asian American and, you know, civic engagement and participation, I have to believe your work and the way you've understood it has exponentially helped grow it by, you know, congregating a community of leadership around this kind of data. And I just a simple question, were you aware from the beginning that this is the kind of influence you could have? Was this the plan you had in mind when you started this work?
No, I mean, I'll tell you, like, so going down the path of surveys, so it was 2008, and we had seen in 2006 and 2007, there was a Latino national survey that some colleagues had put together. And that was actually pretty incredible. They somehow just timed it so that they were able to capture some of the survey data during the big pro-immigrant marches in 2006. So we were really inspired by that. So we went to fundraise with other colleagues for the National Asian American Survey. And so we were in the process of securing our funding by spring, early summer, and we were going to conduct this as a post-election survey, right, to see how people voted. And, you know, we didn't get the funding in time to do anything before the election. But that year, if you remember, it was the Democratic primary. It was hotly contested between Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton. And Super Tuesday, California and New York were part of Super Tuesday in 2008. So the only data that existed were the exit polls. And we know that the national exit polls have strong limitations. It's English only. They're not intended to capture the nuances of the Asian American community. But that said, it was the only data point, and what it showed was that Hillary Clinton had the strongest support of any racial group among Asian Americans. So you would have thought that the headlines the next day or that week would have said, you know, what is it about Hillary Clinton that, you know, she's attracting all the support? Is it maybe something to do with the Clinton administration and all the outreach that they did to Asian Americans, maybe having Norm Mineta as the first cabinet secretary? Could have been that kind of a story. But instead, the headlines were, why don't Asians like Black people? And then they went back to 1992, right? And they talked to these so-called experts who just kind of went to that trope. There was nothing in the data in terms of racial attitudes. So I told my colleagues, we cannot wait till the general election. If this is already sinking in terms of the narrative, we need to get this data and we need to like hustle. And they said I was insane. No way that we could pull it off, but we did it. We would pedal to the metal. It's kind of a theme since then. I don't think I've slept much since the summer of 2008, but it was so important. I mean, you have so much media coverage before election day, and after election day, it just kind of crashes because, there's no mystery in terms of who's going to win. So it's not as much of an issue. That did change after 2012. So in 2012, what I found was after the election, not what I found, after the election, an economist reporter called me up. By then, I think one of the rules I would say for anyone listening out there in terms of making sure that, your organization gets covered by news media, one rule is that if someone emails you, like email them back as soon as you can, within the next hour if you could, and just give them your number. Because reporters are on deadline. They're not like academics who have all the time in the world to craft an idea, or say filmmakers, right, who think in terms of like 2-year, 3-year spans in terms of their projects. They're thinking in terms of days, sometimes within hours in terms of filing their story. So this economist reporter calls me, and he was asking me questions about the Vietnamese American population in Orange County. So there was a local race that he wanted to cover. And I walked him through some of the key features about the community. And then he asked me some data questions. And I said, well, you can go to the fact finder and get this data. And he's like, I'm not really good at it. Can you just run the numbers for me? And I said, okay. And so then a light bulb went in my head saying, you know what? Maybe it's not just about, around elections and who we are. These are facts about the community I thought everyone knew. But journalists, they haven't taken classes in Asian American studies. They haven't gone through and read all the reports that various nonprofit organizations and academics have done. So that's how we started API Data. It was a curated website. But one thing I'll say is then the idea was to create a kind of online presence and to make it as a kind of think tank for the API community. And I think we don't call ourselves a think tank. Most think tanks don't call themselves think tanks, right? But I think we've pretty much achieved it to the extent that we inform journalism coverage. We help community organizations. And here, I'll credit the Wallace H. Culture Foundation and Sue Van. That was my first investor, my biggest investor. And what Sue told me was that I don't care that you do these surveys, that these reporters call you and find out what's going on. I care about the community. And you need to create a resource that community organizations can use when it comes to finding data for grant applications and just better understanding their community. So that's been there from the get-go, going, and Sue insisted that I should go and go to different conferences, right? And not just rely on my academic expertise, but to really get to know community organizations, their needs, their concerns, their barriers. And that's been with us from the beginning. So if I had to encapsulate and maybe we can put up a slide about API Data, I think of ourselves as a kind of community oriented or community driven think tank. And I think we've pulled off a pretty rare feat in which we have earned the trust of journalists, we have earned the trust of academics, we've earned the trust of government agencies, and we've earned the trust of community. That's not easily done. And, of course, there are times in which we slip here and there. There's always room for improvement. But yeah, that's been a major part of my work since 2013.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And yes, thank you for all of your work. Now, you've recently used a term, DNA, to frame your work, and that stands for data, narrative, and action. And I wonder if you'd elaborate on that a little bit, because I think it pushes us towards some of these new ideas. So take it away.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah. Some of this, by the way, can be seen as maybe as a kind of Richard Louis, jokingly, but I think even on air a couple of times he called me Dr. Data, right? And of course I wear that title proudly. Data is so important. Without data, if we say that our community has certain needs, people just dismiss that as anecdote, especially government agencies. they want to see evidence, and they want to see systematic evidence. So data is so critical. But what we realized over time, and this is at the Center for Social Innovation that I founded about 3.5 years ago, is that you can't just stop with data. So data is essential. Without data, you get dismissed as not very serious or not providing the kind of systematic evidence. This is why, by the way, our communities have been fighting for data equity, including disaggregated data, original data collection for decades, right? But you also need to have narrative. So without narrative, you have a lot of data points, but it's not meaningful, it's not memorable, it is not really owned by the community in any significant way. And it's really tough to tell stories, whether in news stories or other kinds of stories, if all you have are data points, right? And so this, in some ways, harkens back to my days as a playwright, right? As a film and video production, as a videographer. So really paying attention to narrative. It's also something that I learned in the California Endowment. So I'm in my 6th year in the California Endowment. And when I was in the California Endowment, when I got started, narrative was the name of the game. I mean, narrative drives everything. And sometimes narrative can actually overpower data. Once people have a certain impression in their mind of what is true, it's going to be really, really hard to dislodge them from that perception. So you really need to have both of them together. And then finally, it needs to be married to some kind of strategic action, right? So what I tell folks is that this is not like a PhD dissertation in which you just go and get this data set and like try to figure out what the story is. And there's really no strategic action in mind other than finish the dissertation, maybe, right? Get a job. But we need to have, data and narrative wedded to some kind of strategic action. So when an organization decides we need to get more funding, or we need to change hearts and minds, or we need to enact policy change, that should be the driver. And then you marshal all of the data and the kind of narrative and package it together in order to drive meaningful change. So I'll just give a couple more examples of this. This has been also reflected in our own work. So if you go to the next slide. So one example of at least data and narrative, actually there's data and narrative in action here. So this was in 2014 when President Obama announced the expansion of DACA, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, and the implementation of DAPA, the Deferred Action for Parents of Americans. That day, Migration Policy Institute put out a map with state-level estimates of undocumented by region of origin in the world. I remember calling Sonu Shah that day. He was our GSR for API data, and I get up very early. So I saw that when it hit my mailbox, at like 6 a.m. Pacific time. So I texted Sono. I said, Sono, we gotta get on this. Let's just generate a bunch of dead simple infographics. This is a composite infographic. We also created an infographic for some of the bigger states. And what we showed was it was very simple. It was just a vector image, the number of undocumented Asians, what proportion of the undocumented population of the state they represented, and what proportion of the Asian immigrant population in the state that they represented. And then we just pushed it out there. Our relationships that we had built with community organizations was so critical. Those prior relationships meant that it went viral because of the positive echo chamber that the community generated. We were not part of the narratives of who the undocumented immigrants were, so we flooded social media with that narrative. It all happened so fast that within a day and a half, I got a call from NPR Weekend Edition asking for an interview, and I did an interview with Scott Simon that weekend talking about the underreported stories and our underappreciated understanding of Asian undocumented people. What we also do is not only infographics that just capture a key set of facts, but also the headline that goes with the blog post. So for someone like me whose dissertation was 350 pages, then I go to PPIC and they said, you need to really condense down your work. Initially, they said 100 pages, and they said, really, it needs to be 25 pages. It's really humbling. Most people, they don't even read a blog post. They just see it shared on social. They see the image and the headline, and then they reshare it. Of course, the nerds will dig deeper and read the report and all of that. But you really need to grab people's attention in a very catchy way. And so this is a factoid that was original to us. that 1 out of every 7 Asian immigrants is undocumented. And that was really powerful. We saw members of Congress using that factoid. And it really showed in a powerful way, kind of myth busting within our community. So many Asian Americans think we're the good immigrant, quote unquote. We came here the right way, not realizing how many Asian immigrants are undocumented. Let's go to the next slide. Now, the other point I think, Stephen, that you pointed out is that data and narrative and also investments can play a significant role when it comes to action in the form of civic engagement. So what we saw between 2016 and 2020, we also saw between 2014 and 2018. We saw record gains in voting for Asian and Pacific Islander populations. Now, we saw this for all racial groups, but we over-indexed, and it's no accident. There are 2 main reasons. One is investments in our community. So foundations like the Culture Foundation and the API Civic Engagement Fund, for example, have been investing in different parts of the country, and culture in particular has been doing civic engagement investments for a while. So all of those investments come, bear fruit. We saw that in Georgia with Stacey Abrams. I mean, that was a decade-long investment that finally made a difference. We should also acknowledge that Donald Trump made a difference in 2018 and in 2020. He brought a lot of people out. Among Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, turns out more people against him than for him. But it was a great mobilizing force, right? That's something to think about. He's not going to be on the ballot in 22, but he's, getting active again. He's not on social media. He might come back again. So, what will turnout look like in 22? What will turnout look like in 24? I don't think we can rely on charismatic individuals of either party to be driving turnout in a sustainable way. So investments are critical, and we can't lose sight of their importance and the need to make sure that we continue pushing foundations and pushing parties and campaigns to invest in our communities.
Thank you. Is that?
I think that's it. Let's see. I don't know if there's another slide. I might have one more thing.
Let's see. I can't remember. Good. So let's stay on this slide because I want to have some time for Q&A, but there's so much interest in this now, Karthick. You're taking a bit of a break for a couple of years to run a project that I think comes right out of your storytelling background, and it's called California 100. And I hope you'll tell us a bit more about it. You've just announced it. It's very exciting for all of us who live in California, but it probably, the stories we want to tell are really, right, will impact the rest of the nation and the world. But please tell us about what California 100 is.
Thank you, Stephen. And not to worry, folks outside of California, I have one more trick up my sleeve that's a national project. So California 100, by the way, this is my major area of focus, but I'm not, we're not, losing sight of API data. In fact, we have to build incredible capacity, especially given the investment from the state that we just got to run a quarterly social survey. But California 100, this has been, we've been in, I guess we've been under the radar building this since November of last year. So I guess I can keep a pretty good secret. So we've been keeping the secret for many months now. And what this is, I mean, especially emerging out of COVID, I think what people have found that there's so many systems that are in desperate need of radical redesign, right? A lot of systems are just not working. What we also saw during the pandemic was that so many things that seemed impossible were all of a sudden very possible and actually occurred, right? In terms of the massive stimulus spending, extended unemployment insurance, so many other things that we saw during the pandemic that continue even to today. For example, California just announced that they were providing free lunch to everyone so that you do not have to go through the stigma of proving economic hardship in order to get a free lunch. So that's the context and background. But we shouldn't just pat ourselves on the back. California prides itself as being a state of innovation, being a global leader of innovation. But we also have incredible inequality in our state. So how do we make sure that California remains a state of innovation, but also a state of inclusion? That's what this is about. This is and by the way, you can say this is something new. Many parts of the Western world, especially, we're accustomed to thinking in terms of 2-year or 4-year cycles if we think in terms of elections, or quarterly cycles if you think about publicly traded corporations. Getting people to think 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 100 years, it's usually not done. But we need to be humble. We know that indigenous groups in the US, traditions across the world, they've been doing this for centuries, if not millennia. We're very late to the game. But what climate change has shown us, but even other potential threats like automation and what it means to our society, is that we need to think intergenerationally. By the way, about 1 out of every 2 Californians born today is going to live to 100. Are we creating the kind of California that'll serve them through their lifetime? That is the kind of mindset we need to have, and to think, about our legacies. So it's pretty heady and ambitious stuff. One of the and so most people think, wow, it's impossible. I can't even think 2 years ahead. You're trying to get me to think 100 years ahead. What we're trying to do is to get people removed from all of the reasons why they would say no, that something is impossible and cannot happen, to think about, what is that promised land? What is that Wakanda, right? What is that summit that we're all trying to reach? And then how do we make sure that everyone gets there? I'll just go with an analogy here. Let's just go with the summit analogy, right? By the way, most parts of California, you can look out somewhere and find a mountain somewhere, or like some kind of a hill. That's one of the beauty of California, right? We're not like in the Midwest where it's just, from everywhere you can see it's flat. But if you find that summit, the key is to make sure that we bring everyone with us, regardless of ability, regardless of age, regardless of race, regardless of creed. And along the way, of course, we will find challenges, right? Our campsite might get flooded. Bears might eat our food. So this doesn't mean that only pay attention to the summit, because even to get to the summit, you will encounter challenges along the way and know how to navigate those challenges. But that's what we are trying to do. We're trying to spark a movement. We'll see. I think we've gotten there a little bit, but we're excited. And the name California 100 is intentional. It's to get people to think in 100-year span and cycle.
Thank you. And so there's a website, california100.com.
.org.
Sorry. Yeah. Thank you. We'll try to, good. There we've put up the information. Thank you. And very inspiring. And I do want to move us along. So I'm going to ask you quickly, for the rest of the country, you've got something called New Declaration. Do you mind telling us a little bit about that, Karthick? Storyteller.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. By the way, I should also credit my parents for who I am today, including my mom, right? What you'll see there is a kind of quilt-like pattern. That's the logo. But my mom is a quilter. Part of, I think, where I get my sense of at least graphic design is from my mother. So this is like an American flag themed quilt that she quilted a few years ago. New Declaration is important for us to think about as we approach the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. And, it's a contentious topic. It was a contentious topic in the 200th and the bicentennial, right? The 200th anniversary. And it's going to be again. One of the things that concerns us, and it's a pretty mighty group and growing. And what concerns us is the way our country is like tearing apart at the seams. Yes, we need to have a reckoning of our past. In terms of truth and reconciliation and healing, that's important. But we also need this kind of positive vision of what is this kind of unifying force that takes us forward. And so that's what the Declaration's about. Just go to New Declaration. The first year, we want people to take a deep meditation into the fundamental truths, right? Life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. So this first quarter, we want people to reflect on what does it mean to be alive, right? Especially coming out of the pandemic. Second quarter, what does liberation mean? What does it mean to be liberated, right? Liberty. And then pursuit of happiness, right? We know that money doesn't mean happiness. Money can't buy you happiness. We know all of those sayings. But surely we can't have a country that is happy in the deepest sense of that term with incredible wealth inequality that we have. So getting people to engage with that. And then the final quarter, it's a living declaration. So if you could add one word to the declaration, what would it be and why? So that's the first thing we're doing. We want to continue. one of the partners in the work, I know that CAAM has signed up to be one of the partners, Frederick Douglass Family Initiatives. And I hope people know about the famous 4th of July speech by Frederick Douglass, right? And it showed the harsh contrast between the ideals of the Declaration and the reality of slavery. But it ends on a hopeful note, right? That America can do better to live up to those ideals. So we're, Frederick Douglass Family Initiatives is excited. They have a curriculum program in high schools and elementary schools across the country. They're really excited at the potential of engaging with the Declaration in a fundamentally different way. And then finally, we want to infuse new ideals, right? I think what COVID has shown us and so many other things is that, yes, we're independent, but we're interdependent. Actually, that's something I'd say even about API data. You have think tanks that are independent think tanks. They don't have the kind of impact that they do because they see themselves as removed from the community. We don't see ourselves that way. We see ourselves embedded in the community. Of course, we have academic expertise that we bring to bear. But, I think our survival as a species, our survival as a country depends on us leaning in more towards interdependence, right? Not just rights, but also obligations to each other. And so that we're hoping, maybe by the 250th, that we can create a declaration of interdependence and not just one of independence.
That's beautiful. Thank you, Karthik, for taking us into those projects. And yeah, that resonates so much for all of us at CAAM. The kind of media that we aspire to, that we celebrate, is very much purposeful media that has to be directed at addressing people's lives, building empathy, building compassion, building connection. So we are right there with you. And so with that, I'd like to turn and invite any other questions from the audience. And we had a few folks kind of write in before. Here's one. How do you convince the media and the general population to care about meaningful data questions versus flashy headlines or catchy content? How do you tell the simple story in a way, the meaningful story?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a great question. Partly it's to be able to boil down the findings to, something that's very easy to understand. Here I would credit people like Richard Louie, right? Who's been an important part. I don't think I guess maybe he would consider himself as a bit of a media coach for me. But there are so many times in which, as academics, we complexify. But complexity does not work well, especially, when it comes to news, and especially when it comes to television news, right? So it's important to be able to simplify. So the art is to figure out how do you simplify it in a way that you don't do injustice, right, to the truth, but to present it in a way in which people can at least kind of get their bearings and maybe want to learn more. But I would say that these are challenging times. And maybe in some ways it's not that new. So in terms of evolutionary science, that you had strong resistance to evolution when it first came about. And you still have a strong resistance, to the science of climate change, which is as close to a consensus as you would get, in the scientific community, where people are always testing for the exceptions, right? But we see it even on, sadly, even when it comes to matters of life and death, right? The data, if you will, when it comes to COVID, and especially with the Delta variant, is unmistakable, right? The overwhelming majority of deaths that are happening right now are among those who are not vaccinated. We would be saving hundreds of lives. We would be relieving the stress and burden on our hospital systems if more people got vaccinated. The science is very clear. And even the data are very, very clear, right? In terms of the risk if you're vaccinated and the risk if you're not vaccinated. But, this is where narrative, this is where beliefs come in so strongly. And so I no longer think that, just by producing the right kind of data, things are going to happen. You need to have the narrative, and you need to have action. Often, community power that pushes it. We can produce the findings, but we rely on advocates who will go to legislators, who will go to government agencies and say, "Here, look at the data." People came up to me after the the infographics we produced, not only did it get me a spot on NPR Weekend Edition, I remember someone from Advancing Justice in Chicago came up to me the following year and said, by the way, what you generated was so useful for us in our conversations with the governor and the state legislature. That's so powerful, right? So it's not data. You can think of data as maybe a hero in the story, but they're, it's just one part of other things that need to be in place.
Good. Let's touch on that. Do we have another question out there queued up? You want to? Great. Yeah. Jay Asri is a filmmaker. Curious as to whether you have experienced data that was essential to a film sequence, but almost impossible to communicate graphically. Well, that's fascinating. Yeah, I'll let you have to wind your head through some particular.
By the way, so I couple of things I'll say. First, and maybe I'll take a couple of stabs at that question. I think I'll have to reflect on that for a little bit. But one, I'll say, and this might be a little challenging for people might resist this notion that when people are producing works of art, that it needs to be representative. That if you're an artist, you focus on something that inspires you in whatever way. Either it repels you or it draws you in, it generates emotion. So, is there a burden of representation? There's so many ways to think about that question. But one thing I'll say is that if all people have is a certain kind of portrayal of our community that is totally at odds with what our community looks like, we need to do double, triple duty to make sure that people don't mistake that for the norm, right? I'll give an example, and this may be controversial, because when Crazy Rich Asians came out, people saw that as a key moment in representation for our community. I was ambivalent, and I still remain ambivalent today, right? All the people today saying, don't think we're all rich. There's so many poor people in our community, and we're not all Chinese. Look at all the brown Asians, look at the Pacific Islanders, look at Southeast Asians. Well, if we double, triple down and said, this is our major moment for representation and we're going to go all in. Now, of course, people said, well, this is the first of many instances in which we will mobilize tremendously to support this kind of work. But I haven't seen it since. I mean, that was like our kind of key moment where we put in all of our chips. And then later we can't really then say, oh, we're not all rich. But it's like, people can't. If there's like a key kind of thing that's like it's just really hard to create new impressions in the back of the brain, if you will, right? In terms of kind of the assumptions. A couple other things I'll say. In terms of thinking about data and how it gets communicated visually, let's talk more later. I mean, I've been thinking about explainer videos, and we tried our hand at it in 2016. It took so much effort, and it was kind of depressing when we looked on social. After the first 8 seconds, attention just plummeted. I was like, I'm not really sure we're gonna create explainer videos anymore. But we would love to figure ways that we can combine what we find in terms of data with storytellers. Final thing I'll say, I think very metaphorically and graphically. And so one of the ways I thought, not only does data narrative action spell DNA, so if there's anyone who's an animator in the mix here, let's collaborate on something. I've thought about data as points, right? Data points. And then think of narrative as connect the dots, right? Remember those old connect the dots thing? And then so imagine then that's like a kind of human stick figure, right? And then action is just like that getting animated. So yeah, I mean, I think that there are ways to think about data as kind of background context, but at the very least, playing some role in thinking about representation and where the artist stands vis-a-vis, other larger truths in society.
Yeah. There is so much we've packed in here. We're drawing to a close. I want to try to pull together some sense and do it in the form of a question for you. If you're sensing the same thing we are at CAAM, out of this terrible year, it's interesting. I think you credited, Trump in a way for being such a larger than life polarizing figure, that's brought about, I think, unleashed a lot of dangerous things in our society. But it's also galvanized the Asian American community to perhaps see itself in a different way than it did before. And I think that our community, so many of them, sort of felt like our best survival technique was to keep the head down, not be present, just focus on your own, path, maybe your own family, but to enjoy the privilege we've been allowed to be this wedge community and the ones that can prove a meritocracy without providing equal opportunity to everyone. I think you know where I'm going. I'm wondering if you feel the Asian American community now, if we have been transformed to this next place, what is that place? What is our opportunity? What is our obligation? Have your thoughts about that changed or during these last few years?
Yeah, no, thank you, Stephen. Yeah, I mean, I think, well, I'll maybe take it one level further than you. I don't know if you'll go there, Stephen, but I think for a fair number of Asian Americans, I think they actually bought the kind of honorary whiteness, right? Just like Jews before us, that we were today's Jews, that with enough economic success and assimilation, essentially accepting of kind of white norms and the white power structure, that we would be invited in and would assimilate. And there's some evidence of that, right? You have pretty high rates of intermarriage, for example. Demographers will tell you that Asian Americans are the most assimilated of the communities of color. In fact, there are sociologists who say that Asians will become white, just like the Irish did. Mm-hmm. But I think moments like this, actually prior to this, 9/11, I think we can look back on that. I think what you might see moving forward is the kind of transformation you saw in South Asian communities. Very strong levels of civic engagement, and people running for office, people entering into public service. So it's not, so part of it is, but the thing is, it's not, what's interesting about 2020 is not only the pandemic and the increase in hate, but we also have an Asian American vice president, right? It's pretty remarkable. And a woman, right? So I'm hoping, people talked about a kind of Hillary effect where a lot of women decided to run for office in 2018. I'm hoping that we'll see a Kamala effect, right? In terms of having more people wanting to enter into public service, wanting to run for office, regardless of their party. It's a historic achievement. I feel like we haven't, because of the pandemic and everything else, I don't think we've, it's fully sunk in for us to appreciate what that has meant. But what it means moving forward, I do think it's a level shift. So if you saw that, actually, if you go to, I don't know if we have this graphic up yet. We will shortly if we don't. If you look at different age groups, you saw the biggest proportional increase among 18 to 35-year-olds. Mm. And usually, at least what the political science literature tells us, is whatever happens to people in their 20s ends up setting them up for the rest of their lives. What we actually saw in prior elections was that younger Asian Americans were underperforming compared to other communities of color. And that, that shifted in this election cycle. So I think we have created a kind of new level up, if you will. But we can't take it for granted. I still think, investments are essential. And yeah, we should not be lulled, into thinking that that somehow, if we do the right things and act the right way, that that we will be accepted into these systems of white privilege and white supremacy. We really need to focus on dismantling those systems. I'll leave you with one final image. You see all those pictures of diversity, equity, inclusion, and right where you have the people behind the fence and the baseball games. I don't know if people have seen that. The handy guide to how you think about equality versus equity versus liberation. Thinking about liberation, One of the things I remember when I was in grad school, going and doing field work in 2000, going around and interviewing people in Asian American communities, they talked about the crabs in the bucket mentality. That when people were trying to advance, it's like crabs in a bucket in which someone else in the community would pull you down. I think we've gone beyond that, but still there's so many crabs left in the bucket because not everyone gets to leave. I think ultimately, as Asian Americans, what we need to do is to topple that bucket over, right? So that everyone's liberated. But, easier said than done, but I think I'm hopeful. I think that people really saw, what lies at the root of so many problems that we face. And I'm hopeful that at least a critical mass of them have committed themselves to spend their lifetimes to dismantle that.
Karthick Ramakrishnan, thank you so much for being with us tonight. Thank you all out there for tuning in and watching us. We're going to be recording this so you can, share, urge your friends and colleagues to watch it. We've got a couple of different movements to join now: California 100, the new declaration, and please, everyone, be well. Thanks, Karthick. See you soon, and we got a lot of work to do together.
We're going to have a lot of fun too, Stephen. I'm looking forward to it.
Okay. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.